Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, especially our virtual audience and to all our presenters. Welcome to the first webinar of the CGIAR Gender and Agriculture Research Network. And we're very delighted to be hosting this together with the CGIAR Research Program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. Today's webinar will be 1 hour and 15 minutes long. We have 3 panelists, all from CCAFS, and who will be presenting for a time of 15 minutes each. The purpose of today's webinar is mainly to talk about what's missing in the post-COP21 environment, and especially in terms of gender considerations. The CGIAR Research Program on climate change, agriculture, and food security carried out an analysis last year in November, and it looked at the country-level climate plans that were submitted to the UN ahead of the climate talks in Paris, which then highlighted the need for technical assistance and climate finance for adaptation and mitigation strategies related to agriculture. So based on this, today's talk will be really looking at 3 different levels in terms of gender considerations, providing first of all, a global policy perspective, then looking at it from a regional perspective, and then looking at it from a national policy perspective. So before I introduce our speakers, just a few sort of housekeeping rules. We will be taking questions at the end. You can send in your questions via the chat function. So we will have 3 presentations, each 15 minutes each, after which we will open up the floor for questions. Our first presenter is Sophia Heyer, who is the Gender and Social Inclusion Research Leader of the CGIAR Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security Program. And Sophia will be taking us through a global policy perspective to look at the outcome of COP21 and what this really means and what we're missing.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you all today. I'm going to be presenting on a Latin American regional perspective. The presentation is based largely on CCAFS work with a group of decision makers focusing on agriculture and food security and rural development issues in target Latin American countries. To begin, I'll be giving a brief explanation of this Latin American regional initiative. Then I'll give a short overview of CCAF's policy analysis that it carried out last year on the degree of gender integration in policies related to climate change, agriculture, and food security in target Latin American countries. Then I will share some challenges and opportunities identified through the policy analysis and through our work with the group of Latin American decision makers. And then I'll finish with some key takeaways for your further comment and discussion. Now, in 2014, at the COP20 in Lima, CCAFS in Latin America carried out a regional workshop on climate change policy and gender. A key foundation of the workshop was that gender integration in public policies in the agricultural sector are integral to confront the impacts of climate change. A motivation of the workshop was to begin an initiative with representatives of secretaries and ministries of agriculture, as well as rural development organizations in Latin American countries to begin problematizing what are the most effective approaches, strategies, methods for integrating gender in policies related to climate change. To this end, an important goal of the workshop was exchange of experiences on gender integration thus far from the institutions from which the representatives came. Some significant experiences that were shared at the workshop all point to a lack of gender-aware policymaking. For example, the representatives mentioned lack of sex disaggregated data, lack of articulation between national and local levels in order to be able to really integrate gender in a meaningful way in policies. They also highlighted a disrecognition of women's role in production and technology, and they also mentioned that while there did exist women-focused programs, These often fail to address climate change, or they fail to be really gender transformative, reducing gender gaps in access to productive resources, for example. Some takeaways from the workshop were that it was necessary to build knowledge on best practices for integrating gender in policies. This included systematizing all the experiences and information that other organizations were putting into practice regarding gender integration. They also highlighted the importance of having forums for continuous knowledge exchange. These included forums at local, regional, and national levels. Also, the role for CIAT and CCAFS that evolved out of all of this was to develop tools and knowledge products for gender integration. For example, over the last year, we've developed policy briefs for Peru and Colombia on gender considerations for integrating gender in policies related to climate change in the agricultural sector. We've also developed a list of guidelines for how to integrate gender into a policy on climate change. Parallel to this work with the group of Latin American decision makers, CIAT and CCAFS has also been involved in policy analysis in order to evaluate the degree of gender integration in policies related to climate change and agriculture. The review included 105 policy instruments and focused on the countries of Colombia, Peru, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and a few key documents from the Central American region. A rubric was developed to evaluate degree of gender integration, going from 1 to 5, 1 signifying no reference to gender issues at all, and 5 signifying gender integrated clearly through the objectives to action plan to budget and monitoring and evaluation. I'll just be going over the results briefly here. There is an article in the Journal of Gender, Agriculture, and Food Security that goes into more detail on the analysis. But here you'll see that across the gamut of 105 policy instruments that were included, the majority did not refer to gender issues at all, and none scored a 5. However, if we look specifically at those policies related to agriculture and food security, you see more of a bell-shaped curve with more policies concentrated in the 3 grade level, meaning that gender was integrated clearly into policy objectives. Then if we look specifically at those policies, laws, plans, and strategies on climate change, we see that almost all of these either did not refer to gender issues at all, or they only referred to gender discursively. Discursive reference to gender signifies a 2. You'll see that the only policy instrument that scored a 4 was the regional strategy on climate change for Central America. In general, the results from the policy analysis suggest a lack of articulation among sectors. For example, that policies do exist that integrate gender on themes like agriculture, as one of the previous charts showed, and also development planning. However, climate change policymaking fails to take these into account. Correspondingly, various agricultural sector policies do integrate gender, but often these do not address climate change specifically. The results from the policy analysis resonate with our work with the group of Latin American decision makers. Their feedback regarding efforts from their institutions to integrate gender over the last year since COP20 also suggests something that gets repeated over the past years with regards to challenges. Note that there still exists a lack of awareness of importance of gender concerns within the various levels of government. And this speaks to why so many policy instruments included in the review scored a 1 or a 2, not referring to gender issues at all or only discursively. Decision makers also highlighted a lack of resources for gender specialists within their institutions, and this posing a significant challenge to integrating gender. They also highlighted lack of agreement on gender concepts among partner organizations, and also a lack of a gender focus clearly articulated in policies and programs coming out of their institutions as a result of the decision-making processes used in their institutions. And then they also emphasize a need for gender-sensitive monitoring and evaluation of projects. It's worth highlighting that these last 3 bullet points exemplify that efforts are being made to integrate gender, although perhaps these are not going far enough. Some suggestions for best practices do develop out of these discussions with the decision makers and from the policy analysis. First, that participatory processes can be key for promoting gender integration in policy making. Then that international legal instruments can serve as important guides that motivate gender inclusion. And on this note, also very key can be gender policies at an institutional level. Feedback from the decision makers we've been engaging with have emphasized this also. And then lastly, that alliances that include the state and civil society can promote a greater commitment to gender inclusion at the institutional level. And a really helpful learning opportunity for seeing these best practices being put into use is the Climate Change Gender Action Plan in Peru, currently in progress. It's very much based on participatory processes with local men and women in communities across the country, and collaborates with diverse state and civil society organizations, capitalizing on the various gender expertise and experience that these organizations can provide to the action plan process. Another opportunity identified through our work over the last year has to do with the importance of making local experiences really relevant in policy making on climate change at the national level, reaching out to grassroots organizations. From a line of beginning work with rural women's organizations and university programs in Colombia, from CCAFS and CIAT, we've been learning that what's being seen as far as incorporating grassroots experiences into policymaking requires getting past a few challenges. For example, a need for capacity building for rural women on climate change. Also, a need to visibilize the differential effects of climate change on men and women. These are actually observations that the grassroots organizations have voiced themselves. Additionally, the need to reflect community interests and strategies in order for them to be really effective, which requires involving local men and women in policymaking processes. And they also highlight the importance of a social differentiation focus. So by recognizing that men and women have varied preferences and interests when it comes to climate change adaptation and mitigation actions, also recognizing that these preferences and interests vary across territories, across the country. So to sum up, we can see that efforts are being made to integrate gender since COP20. However, there are still significant challenges to making really meaningful gender integration happen, such that policies have real impact on the ground. We can, however, capitalize on some potential opportunities. For example, alliances with civil society, participatory processes to connect with local experiences, making visible the gender-differentiated impacts of climate change, and this includes gender-differentiated contributions to climate change solutions. And here, empirical research can be really key, in addition to connecting local experiences, case studies as such, to national levels. And then continuing work to document case studies and best practices. This is a work in progress, and I know several of the organizations connected today have been involved in this, including GGCA. And then finally, continuing to coordinate forums like these for knowledge exchange. So thank you again for the opportunity to be with you all, and look forward to your feedback and input. All right. Let's see. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks Martina, and thanks Tatiana for your presentation. I think it's a good complement to some of the things I'll be saying. As Martina had mentioned, CCAFS did an analysis of the intended national contributions of countries for COP21, and so I will discuss the analysis we did of that as well as of gender in the Unfccc process as well. But first I'd like to open with a brief overview of the gender gap in agriculture and climate change. Why is this an important gender equality issue? Well, we know from work by Cheryl Doss that 79% of women in least developed countries report agriculture as their primary economic activity. The total number of women in the agricultural workforce is almost at parity, and we also know that women make up 2/3 of the small livestock managers around the world. So women are an important force in agriculture globally. We also know that they have lower access to resources for agriculture. This includes technology, information, agricultural inputs, land, and labor. So much so that the World Bank talks about a productivity gap between women and men around the world, so that women tend to own and run the smaller and less profitable farms in less profitable sectors, and this is also true for the small enterprise. And as some of you may know, the FAO has calculated that if we were to close this gender gap in agriculture, globally yields would be increased by 20 to 30%, which would reduce the global hungry population by 100 to 150 million. So this is a critical issue moving forward. We also know from CCAFS research and from others that there are very strong gender differences in vulnerabilities and capacities to deal with climate change. Some of the research I'm about to talk about was presented in March 2015 at a seminar on gender, agriculture, and climate change. Part of the reason for these differences are the lower level of access to resources, combined with the responsibilities that women have, which include child care, fuel, wood, and water collection often, as well as increasing responsibilities for the family farm when men migrate to the urban areas for employment. Women may be less able to adapt to climate change impacts on agriculture because of financial or resource constraints that they have, and their less access to information and extension as well as other inputs. We also do know that, though, that when they do have access to information, they use it to adapt to climate change issues as much as men do, and in some cases even more. Environmental stress, we know, causes intensification of women's workloads and decreases in assets of poor households, while in specific incidences in some of the countries' research that was presented in March and is just concluding, we know that women are less likely to buy microinsurance, for example, for agriculture if the risk is low probability, while men are likely to buy more. We know that women's participation in REDD+ decision-making is very low in a case study in Vietnam. And we know that cultural norms related to gender roles may limit the ability of women to respond or make quick decisions in the face of climate events. Some of this may relate to the fact that their husbands are elsewhere and they need to consult with them before they can make the decisions. In terms of disasters, clothing or childcare duties may limit their ability to respond quickly to floods, for example. And there are a number of these similar issues that will affect women and men differently in response to climate change. We also know that there are differences between women and men in interaction with institutions, and this is at local levels as well as national levels. So at the local level, we're learning from our research that women tend to interact more with informal community-based organizations around agriculture, food production, and most importantly, social support issues, while men, farmers, tend to interact more around food production with more formalized or external institutions such as the extension, national departments, or external NGOs. So all of these differences combine to affect the way that women and men are impacted by climate change and can respond to climate change. What does this mean? That really, if we don't take these into account, the global target of reducing emissions by 1.5 degrees Celsius will be that much more elusive. But also, very importantly, we need to understand that if we don't support women to address climate change, we may see not only an increase in global gender equalities, but a widening of the global gender gap in agriculture. So why is this important, and how do climate policy frameworks address these issues? Well, we know they do at two levels, and what we need to see is that climate change policies understand these issues and take into account gender differences, roles, capacities, particularly in relation to agricultural and environmental management. They need to recognize that women are active agents in developing responses, and as well, women should have a place at the table at all levels, as Tatiana has already pointed out. But at the global level, we are far from gender parity in climate change, in climate policy. The Unfccc has been taking steps to increase the representation of women and to bring about a gender balance in its bodies and in the negotiations, but there's still a long way to go. As you can see in this graph here, in 2015 we had a low of 6% of women's participation in the Climate Technology Center and Network to a high of 40% participation in the Joint Implementation Supervisory Committee. In the very important position of heads of party delegations, women made up approximately 1/3. So this is progress, but we're not there yet. What did we see at COP21 in terms of gender equality? UNFCCC policy in response to the Lima Work Program on Gender, which was developed at COP20, has been making some progress, and we have seen over the years 50 decisions support the recognition and integration of gender. The Women and Gender constituency is an active voice and an official body of the UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement has some references to gender. Gender equality and women's empowerment are included in the preamble of the Paris Agreement at COP21, along with other social issues, other important social issues. And there are two references in elsewhere in the document that call for gender responsive actions and capacity building. But unfortunately, that is just about it. So there is a lack of a real detailed, specific, kind of targeted recognition of gender issues in the Paris Agreement. Our analysis of the INDCs in terms of gender and social issues shows a similar approach. Of the 160 submissions that were made before COP21, 131 made a reference to agriculture. So that means that 131 countries recognize the importance of agriculture in terms of climate change. So that's a good start. However, only 10 mentioned women or gender in relation to agriculture. That's very, very low, obviously, a very low recognition. The highest representation of social issues in the INDCs was around poverty and the recognition that climate change could increase poverty, but also it was important to address poverty in the context of climate change. That was about 70 countries made reference to that. 57 countries made reference to gender in any capacity at all, in terms of gender mainstreaming, in terms of the importance of supporting women, in terms of the role of women in social improvement in the country. However, most of those references were very general and very unconnected to actual climate change issues, climate change adaptation or mitigation. Mostly the references were made in reference to women being a vulnerable group and the impacts that climate change could have on women and resilience. In terms of actual references to women's active participation in climate change related sectors and activities, and I'm calling it generally here gender and natural resource management, but in that category is gender and energy, agriculture, environmental management, and water. There were only 26 countries mentioned any of those combined. And while there were quite a few references to gender in relation to social policy, in reference to poverty reduction policy, there were only 20 references to gender in terms of any aspect of climate change policy or strategy, with 3 countries making a reference to a gender and climate change policy strategy or action plan. So what do we say is missing here? Well, as I mentioned earlier, most of the references are that women are vulnerable. Women are going to be affected negatively by climate change, and they need help for resilience. And that's reflected as well in the Paris Agreement, which looks at building capacity of women, primarily. There's a lack of recognition not only of women's role in these sectors and in these activities, but women's knowledge and innovation, or their specific role in adapting to and mitigating climate change impacts. There are no references to monitoring and evaluation of either in the Paris Agreement, some in the INDCs, around how do you measure progress in this, how do you measure whether gender and social issues are addressed in relation to climate change. And the final 2 comments I'd make here are in connection with what Tatiana has said, but going in a slightly different direction. We don't see in the Paris Agreement or in the INDCs a very strong alignment with global gender policy in other areas, such as the CEDAW, which is gender and human rights. We don't see any connection to Rio Plus 20. We don't see connections to the Beijing policy platform for action from 1995. And we see very little recognition of women as active agents and contributors to the solution rather than victims of the problem. So while the UNFCCC has made a start with its focus on encouraging more women into various bodies and in terms of making some references around gender responsive capacity building, understanding that gender equality is one of the issues that need to be taken into account, there has been no real progress beyond that first step. And that, as we've seen with Tatiana, in Tatiana's presentation, there needs to be much more building in of the voices of women and other groups into the policy, the climate policy process at all levels. There need to be more open avenues and opportunities for groups to represent their concerns and to propose solutions and to take them to the negotiations table. Some of the upcoming institutional opportunities to work on this include, in the next few months, there is the June 2016 workshop of the UNFCCC Lima Work Program on Gender, and that workshop is on gender and adaptation and capacity building. So there is work right now on that, on developing the agenda. So there's an opportunity for inputs through that. The subsidiary body for scientific and technical advice has just released a request for submissions on socio-economic and gender equality concerns with a deadline in March. So that's an opportunity to make submissions. Outside of the UNFCCC, some of these mechanisms have actually fairly well developed gender equality guidelines and input mechanisms that really could be taken advantage of. Red Plus, I think, is one opportunity that needs to be more fully taken advantage of and looked into. The Green Climate Fund has a very well-articulated gender equality policy, and it also has some very strong mechanisms for integrating and receiving submissions around gender equality. The Global Environment Facility is another one. The Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions, the NAMAs, are an opportunity at the national level to have inputs and influence on national policy. And finally, in Africa, NEPAD has developed the Development Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, which is, again, another opportunity for input. And I think there are gender advocacy groups at all levels. At the global level, there's the Women's and Gender Constituency, and there's the Global Gender and Climate Change Alliance. At the national levels, there are other groups. The IUCN is also working around advocacy, and I think that this is time for the gender and agriculture, gender and climate change groups to pull together, to bring together their research, their experience, and to really look for and leverage opportunities to change the way the policy around the UNFCCC and national level climate policy is developed. This is a really critical issue, and while it's not on the table as fully as we would like, there is at least a recognition that it needs to be, and so I think that if we take this opportunity, that we can work together to try and bring in a much more appropriate and positive discussion to the table around gender equality, social inclusion, and the effects that climate change can have, both socially and economically. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Okay, Wendy, we'll move on to your presentation next. Wendy, can you hear us? No. Yeah. I can't see her. Wendy, can you try again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, great.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to be looking at the study that we had done in northern Uganda. We did a policy analysis and how gender is implicated in policy in Uganda. So we looked at northern Uganda and Rakai districts. And our key objectives was, one, to critically analyze the existing policies and looking at the gaps, the overlaps, and the contradictions. Then we also wanted to look at the gender inclusion in both the existing policies and the newly formulated policies. And the third thing that we wanted to do with this study was to identify key state and non-state institutions in Uganda at all administrative levels. If you could just show the next slide, please. So we looked at the country context, and we looked at the political context, the policy environment, and the broad framework of policy in Uganda. So one of the things that we noticed with the political history of Uganda is that policy is very much embedded in the political processes, in the policy development processes. And these obviously shape how policy discourse takes shape in the country. The implementation of policy, the formulation of policy was also influenced by the discourses at the global level, the regional level, and the national level. We also looked at the broad framework of policy in Uganda, and we looked at the legal structure. So if policy is formulated and implemented, then how is it enforced? We looked at different laws, we looked at different decrees to see how that is done. We also looked at the policy development process. So how is policy formulated? Who makes decisions? Who is involved? Who is not involved? In essence, who is excluded, who is not excluded, and how that ultimately shapes policy and gender inclusion in that regard. We looked at donor support, the finance and budget strategy, how funds are allocated, who decides what funds go where, and how funds are allocated, to gender mainstreaming or to gender issues. Then we looked at the broad institutional framework of how that supports or does not support gender mainstreaming in climate change and agricultural activities in the country. So our methodology, if you could go to the next slide, please. Our methodology focused on, we had 10 focus group discussions on policy implementation. We did focus group discussions with men and women separately. And at the same time, we also conducted semi-structured interviews with different levels at the district level, at the national level, and at the local parish levels. So we conducted different interviews with different people. We go to the next slide, please. Then the policies that we looked at was the National Agricultural Policy, the 2011 one. We looked at the Uganda Forestry Policy, the Uganda National Climate Change Policy, the National Land Policy, the National Adaptation Program of Action Strategy, the National Policy for Conservation and Management of Wetland Resources. Now, from these policies, we had a very specific things that we were looking at. And maybe if you could go to the next slide. We wanted to find out the extent to which gender was analyzed through three main, what we'd call maybe axes, or three main themes. So we wanted to look at the extent to which women are involved in the decision-making processes. So if policies are formulated, are women involved in this formulation process? And what kind of involvement are women put in? Then we wanted to look at the extent to which policies address access and ownership of resources. We wanted to look at the extent to which policy increases alternatives and the choices for women in food security, adaptation, mitigation, and agriculture. So in a nutshell, we found out what the constitutional context sort of looked at. And maybe if you could go to the next slide, I could elaborate a little bit more on this. So one of the key things that really stood out was a skewed budget allocation. So district level funds were not evenly allocated across sectors. So like in Nwaya district, we would find more funds were allocated to education, and less funds were allocated to probably gender implementation or gender mainstreaming. So from this, we could tell the lack of commitment to allocate funds for gender mainstreaming. So in as much as we found that some of the objectives in these policies were really gender oriented, in regard to implementation, in regard to how funds were allocated, there wasn't much commitment towards that. Then there was the issue of overlapping mandates between sectors. So certain sectors had the same objective. And the problem with having overlapping mandates in policies is that there is the tendency of lack of ownership of the gender problem. no specific sector would say that they own the gender problem, that they're going to carry this gender problem and implement it through and through. There was that issue again. Then there was the limited technical capacity of the staff themselves at the district level and at the national level. Limited technical capacity in terms of understanding climate change issues and how gender and climate change issues are related. So that limited capacity obviously has effects on how gender is mainstreamed into climate change discourse, or how gender issues are addressed at the local and district levels. Then at the local level, there was very limited policy literacy. The policies are made for the people, but the people do not understand the policy. Most of these policies are written in English, and when you go to the local level, to the community level, the women that are there do not understand what these policies are saying. So there's the need of having policies probably even translated into a language that these women can understand. And then there was the little attention being paid to the local context. For instance, the environment policy would had a policy statement to transfer land, to have land titles, but this was not something that was practical in Nwaya district, because Nwaya also had a very complex history of how land is transferred and how land is owned and accessed. Nwaya district had a history where there are very strong kinship male ties to access of land, to transfer of land, and to ownership of land. So policies like that were very difficult to implement at that level. Then when we look at the political context, if maybe you could just go to the next slide, please. The political context is largely shaped by what was Uganda are embedded in is really what was inherited from the colonial period. And the country is currently going a restructuring phase, and there's the devolution of power. Though from the studies that we did, we noticed that power was still very much at the national level. The district level and the sub-county levels did not have much power. They did not have much say in terms of pushing the gender agenda in their districts and in their counties. A lot of this was, the decisions were made at the national level, and really the district level and the county and the sub-county levels were excluded from this very important exercise. And we also realized that because of just how the political context is shaped, there's ineffective implementation of programs geared towards sustainable climate change as well as gender mainstreaming. So what were the key findings that we established? If you could go to the next slide, please. Of the policies that we analyzed, the term gender and women were often used interchangeably. So the consideration of men's adaptive capacity to climate change was widely overlooked in these policies. And then there was also the use of gender stereotypes. So women were portrayed as vulnerable and, as key agents of change. So again, this also just there's the idea that women are the ones to carry the burden of climate change. They're the key agents of change. So there was that problematic discourse going on around the policies that we reviewed. And there was a simplification of vulnerability, ignoring the broad spectrum of women and men that exist in society, because there were women who were not as vulnerable as some women. And indeed, there were some men that were more vulnerable than some women. So these little nuances were not articulated in policy. Then there's the aspect of intersectionality. Uganda has about 56 ethnic groups, and these ethnic groups have different social divides, and these social divides obviously make some more vulnerable and others not as vulnerable. So that intersectionality was not accounted for in the policies that were observed. If you could go to the next slide, please. And then there was the insufficient consideration of the structural constraints that hinder women from effectively participating from being effectively addressed. So the failure to comprehensively address gendered power dynamics at different levels. And there was also, since most land is held under customary tenure, most women do not have effective ownership of land. These issues were not sufficiently addressed. The issues of how women do not have access to land and how women are structurally constrained because of different issues, being constrained in terms of access to broader issues like education, access to resources like land, resources like finance and all that. All these factors that hinder women from being effectively included in the climate discourse were not considered. Then there was poor harmonization of policies. So several disengagements between gender approaches in different policies. Different sectors had different ways of which they wanted to achieve, to address the gender problem. And this lack of harmonization meant that resources were not effectively streamlined to address the gender problem. If you could go to the next slide, please. So again, the constraints that we found is that women are not fully integrated in decision-making processes. Land co-ownership has been unsuccessful and should be addressed within the socio-cultural context. For instance, the socio-cultural context that we faced in Nwaya, where it was just difficult to implement ownership of land because of the social-cultural aspects that shape the understanding of ownership and access of land itself. And then gender considerations are not budgeted for. For example, the financial year of 2013 to 2014, none of the guiding principles for gender integration was implemented. So there's in as much as there's the mention of gender, there is still not enough goodwill to actually put money where the gender problem is, and that is something that could be also looked at. If we could go to the next slide. Gender provisions have weak structures of operationalization, just like I mentioned, no budgets. There's a lack of an implementation plan that articulates how gender is going to be incorporated in the different interventions of the policy. So in as much as gender is mentioned in policy, there's no follow-through of how gender is going to be mainstream or how women are going to be included in this discourse and that kind of thing. So gender concerns are also at a very superficial level because it doesn't consider the structural levels. So the barriers like low levels of education or high levels of poverty, lack of ownership of assets, these are things that were not considered in a very critical manner in the policies that were observed. And if this could be considered, I mean, these are one of the ways that policies could be more effective. If you could go to the next slide. So, in as far as the alternative approaches that we could see from this case study, the case study of Rakai and Nwaya, I think 4 critical things emerge. One, the inclusion of women in the climate discourse should take an approach that destabilizes the power relations, because we found that the the policies tended to address the practical needs of women, but these were not transformational as such. More focus should be on equity, since women are central to exposures of risks and associated with climate change and vulnerability. Then climate change related policies should include women within sustainable development and not as an addendum, because there was the tendency of just putting gender there without an implementation plan, without a specific budget, and without allocating responsibility and roles as to how these are going to be carried out. Then policy should also seek to address these structural barriers that we've spoken about: low levels of poverty, lack of education, lack of access, social cultural barriers, and that kind of thing. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. Thanks to all our presenters today and also our audience who had to deal with some of our technical difficulties, so we apologize for that. So I think just in a nutshell, while we look at some of the questions that we had come in, overall, in terms of how the presentations have been laid out, they've looked at, the global policy implications and the importance of gender considerations. I mean, looking at Sophia's presentation, where she talked about gender in agriculture in the context of the INDCs and the need for a greater recognition of women's active role, and really looking at the opportunities where we have levers such as the events and consultations coming up to really contribute to improving this at a global policy level. Looking at it more so from a regional context, especially through Tatiana's example, I think one of the key streams that came out from the work that CCAFS has done has also been this sort of continuing collaboration, because it's looking at all your various stakeholders who are part of this policy contribution process and really trying to identify what the gender integration levers and current plans and strategies are, and how you can think about establishing the right sort of alliances and really developing these joint mechanisms that enable local women's rural organizations, for example, in the context of Colombia, to really participate in these climate change policy interventions. And finally, we had Wendy from more of a national policy perspective, really sort of bringing in and tying up the idea that in this sort of post-COP21 context, there has been this thread of women being portrayed as vulnerable, and also really the very stereotypical perceptions of gender and women, and then being used interchangeably. And one, I think, that came out during COP21, during the Global Landscapes Forum sessions as well, that CCAFS and others were a part of, was also how structural constraints, especially women's lack of access to resources such as land, education, as Wendy portrayed, how that really is a perspective that needs to reinforce national policy. So we had a few questions earlier on that were submitted during our pre-registration process, which I think most were woven into the presentations that were given in by all our panelists today. But one that I think we may want to perhaps get our panelists' thoughts on would be looking at the technology aspect, because that's something I think that we've not really touched upon in these presentations today, but does seem to be a lever coming out from a global level, from a national level, and from a regional perspective as well, is how do you see new or current technologies contributing to the work of organizations, government agencies, the local collaborators that you've been working with, and how do you see this really contributing to helping ensure that gender is woven into policy implications and considerations in this post-COP21 context? So I'm not sure which of our panelists would like to respond to that. Sophia?
I think new technology, can you hear me?
Yes, Sophia.
Okay. I think that new technologies, information and communication technologies, I'm assuming is what you mean,
Yeah.
are really very important and could make a difference. You know, we see them making a difference with young people in different parts of the world, and how they are prompting revolutions in places. And I think that they could be used in a targeted way to really solicit much more effectively the views and the opinions and the inputs from different groups of people, but also importantly to be a venue for providing information to different groups in society. And, you know, women traditionally do not have the same access to information sources as men do. Poor groups of society do not have the same access as the richer groups. And so I think that there's a huge potential for using these more effectively to connect up with different groups than they have been used. And partly it's, you know, we can't just focus on the smartphone or the computer. I think that some of the less, you know, trendy or the less desirable technologies such as radio, different forms of transmitting information. You know, CCAFS has been finding that if you want to reach women, or reach poor members of society, you really need to use a much broader range of information channels, as well as understanding that different groups need different types of information and need to be able to interact with their information. So you have the FAO examples, the Demetra listening clubs, where they bring in radios into rural communities and use them as a forum for prompting discussion. Or, you know, you can use web chats or Facebook pages or so forth to solicit input from different groups of society. I know CIAT has been doing some really interesting work around giving young people video cameras to present their perspectives on society. So I think it's a really, really important area that has not yet really been you know, used as much as it could be to bring about a positive interaction.
Great. Thank you, Sophia. Would any of our other panelists like to speak to that as well? Wendy or Tatiana?
I could contribute not so much with regards to communication technology, but from experience with other Latin American countries developing dynamics with regards to technology for mitigation, for example. Well, perhaps it's more so having to do with dissemination of technology for mitigation and making sure that that dissemination is urgent responses. So we do see, for example, we're in touch with the Gender Focused Ministry of Agriculture in Costa Rica, and they're working on their Topinama, and in particular really focusing on extension services that are gender sensitive, as far as getting out the technologies being developed for the proper mitigation action. So you do see both different states in Latin America focusing on this aspect, more on dissemination of technologies, making them more gender sensitive for their dynamics. So it does seem like that's an important area of focus for different actors involved in this.
Thank you, Tatiana. Wendy, do you have any perspectives in terms of, you know, the use of technology and dissemination, especially given your work in the national context?
Yes, I mean, I would totally agree with what Sophia has said. In my experience, we've had participatory video exercises in Kenya, which have been very useful in the people telling their story. And in Uganda, we have used, there's a small program with a group in Nwaya district where they have used a web-based system that informs women on agricultural issues, and it's interactive in the sense that these women can ask questions, and there's somebody at a specific center, and they respond to these women on these questions that they have about their farms, and you know, general advice on the weather, climate, fertilizer, and that kind of thing. So indeed, technology is a very useful information in terms of just trying to destabilize that inequality of information out there. So yeah.
Thank you. So I guess one of the main points that comes out in terms of technology is to make sure that you do use different types, and that it's not necessarily only sticking to the new technologies that are present, but rather the mix in terms of whether it's radio, whether it's participatory video, as both CCAFS and CIAT have demonstrated. And another key piece of that is then also ensuring that the dissemination process, it fits the type of technology used, the message, and then also making sure that it reaches or is accessible, especially by women at various levels. And I think that also links back to, if I touch back on Wendy's presentation, of making sure that we do have, you know, policies, information targeted and translated in different languages so that it is much more accessible. I know that we're running short on time, but just one last question that I did have for the panel based on what was submitted beforehand was sent in by the agroforestry, looking at how do we get to practically address gender relations at the household level, which determine the extent to which these policies would then benefit both women and men, which is, I guess, right now we have been really talking about it, looking at it from, you know, commitments from government, looking at it from the local partners that we've been working with. But if we were to, you know, speak to how do we really influence this and ensure that it does drill down at the household level, what would be a recommendation from your experiences that would benefit them from this perspective? Not sure if Sophia, would you? Go ahead.
There's a couple of things that there are a couple of things that we're looking at in CCAFS. I think back to the information thing, we're finding in some cases, and this is not necessarily sufficient, but in some cases we're finding that just making sure, for example, around climate smart agriculture, that women have access to the information that their husbands are getting, that the men in the family household are getting, can contribute either to them discussing the information and the technologies and the practices, the new practices with their husbands. So if they know what is on the table, they have a role in discussing it in the family. There's that side of things, and we've also seen some very interesting approaches around in Latin America, for example, around new ways of providing this information and bringing this information to discussion within the household around games, around family meetings, so forth, or even just through mobile phones and telephone information on activities and technologies and new practices. In Vietnam, what we found is that targeted information towards women to improve their farming practices that is done either in a female-headed household or separately from their husbands, is if it's well taken up, which it is, if it's properly supported around you know, how to produce pest management and improve production practices and so forth. Once their agricultural production increases and they increase their incomes. They are able to diversify their production, the family benefits, and there's increased nutrition levels in the household, and they have increased. They're bringing increased income into the household. That as well in itself gives them greater status in the household and in the community and increases their decision-making status within both contexts. That's not necessarily an automatic situation, and so in different situations I think it's also useful to look at how can you have an effect on how a family interacts in terms of how decisions are made between men and women and the husband and wife, but also bringing in the youth and having them engaged. And I've mentioned the work being done in Latin America, and there's also the work done that IFED has been leading around gender action learning systems, in which there's work with the household members to improve equity in representation, equity in inputs, and to work towards understanding that a household approach to benefits for everyone in the household will increase the benefits for everyone. So these are all the different facets that we're discovering have effect, and which we'll be continuing to pursue and explore.
Thank you, Sophia. Wendy, do you have anything to contribute to that question?
Well, I would also say, mobilizing women at grassroots level, because that collective organizing is a sort of a good forum that women can begin to articulate their own issues and exchange ideas and share on different aspects that can also be useful in informing them at the household level. So I think just the collective organizing of women is also a forum that can be useful.
Great, thank you. And Tatiana?
Yes, I would also add, piggybacking on Wendy's intervention also, that as far as bringing household gender relations to the center of managing policy, also the importance of bringing policy making at national level to the local level. So being able to somehow connect a national level discussions with on-the-ground experiences. So, so an important need would be, for example, as Wendy was saying, being able to support women's organizations such that they can participate in discussions on policy level. But also perhaps motivating support for women policymakers themselves or these new agencies to be able to share or learn from local level experiences. So different types of forums or networks that from local and grassroots to policymaking levels can be really helpful. And the CCAFS has been involved in initiatives like that with the innovation platform. There's not very specific, but as far as getting local people involved in education and the technologies that will be implemented with community levels and that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. I guess really looking at the household level, it's important to ensure that both men and women's interactions are identified and that women have the same sort of access to the information that men do. And I think as both Tatiana and Wendy pointed out, also then making sure that you do mobilize those local organizations and really see how you can support them from, and bringing in policymakers and other state agencies. Well, I think we're close to the end of our webinar. We'd like to make sure that we stick to time. So thank you to all our panelists today, to everyone who joined us virtually, as well as our live audience. Thank you for making it on a Monday, despite all our technical difficulties. We will make sure that the webinar recording is available online on the website, as well as we will also make sure that any additional questions that you may have can still be submitted, and we'll have an online discussion space, including resources such as the presentation, the various publications and info notes as well that were mentioned. So thank you all for joining our first webinar. We hope to have a regular webinar series, and so we'll hopefully see you sometime next month. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Wendy. Bye, Sophia.